Hello and welcome to the GX video series and the podcast. We are at the World Government Summit 2023, and I have with me a fellow Canadian, Ryan Androsoff. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Ian, and it's great to meet you in person. We've had a chance to be on the podcast together virtually a few years ago, but it's
Of
always great
course.
to put a real face to a real name.
Absolutely. And you and I are here from very far away from Canada, right?
Yep.
It's a long flight. But we're here for a very important reason, and that number one, of course, was the World Government Summit,
Yes.
but also is the GX Forum that took place here, bigger than ever before, great presence, really well attended. What have been some of your insights from this whole event?
Yeah, it's been a really impressive last few days, getting a chance to connect with people from all over the world who are passionate about these issues around how do we improve government in the age of digital in particular. And that's, my background is very much around digital services in government, how we modernize how government works. And I have to say, one of the things that really stands out for me is that everyone's essentially dealing with the same thing. They have their unique contexts of their countries, of their culture, of how they're kind of coming at it, but there's these common themes that every country in the world seems to be grappling with. And I'm heartened to hear a lot of the talks we heard this week were about how we have to put citizens and users at the center of the work that we're doing, right? To really be able to focus on the problems, not just jump to solutions. We had some interesting conversations around new technologies like the metaverse. How do we strip away the hype from what's real? And I think it's great to hear on the one hand that there's kind of common themes around this, but there's also common struggles that everybody's trying to work through.
Yeah, and so you've done a lot of work within governments. You've worked with some nonprofits that operate across the world, right? You come with a wealth of experience. Um, it's a tough question for me to ask it, but I wanna ask the reality. Are governments worldwide just talking, or are they doing stuff?
Yeah, it's an important question,
Right?
right? And in my career, I spent many years working inside government, primarily with the Canadian government at the federal level. Worked with international organizations like the OECD. Now have my own company, Think Digital, that does consulting work for governments around digital transformation. And I will say, I think, in the one hand, in the last decade, senior leadership, and I think throughout our government organizations, they are understanding and kind of speaking the language of being agile, being user-centered.
Yeah.
But sometimes we get what people will refer to as agile theater or design theater, where people are saying the words, but they haven't actually changed the way that they operate. I have this mental model I use around this. I call it the Pac-Man Model. I think we actually had an article about it in last year's Forum report. And it's this notion that you have to get beyond strategy, and you have to actually get beyond culture as well, though it's part of it. But you have to start thinking about what are the incentives and the structures of the organization. Because I really think, and I see this in the work that I do, with governments in Canada and internationally, is that until we start really changing the incentives and structures of how governments work, it's going to be difficult to see sustainable long-term change.
Yeah, yeah. So how were your discussions here in the UAE, and anything that stood out for you? Maybe how things are progressing here, how government is working here. What are some of your observations?
Yeah, it's been a very interesting experience because my first time here in Dubai, here in the UAE, and getting to get that kind of firsthand experience with how it's being approached here. I mean, clearly there is a real passion for innovation in the UAE, which just stands out, right? And actually, I was really struck on the panel that I was on earlier today about the metaverse. The official from the UAE government was talking about how they have really been investing in metaverse technology with this notion that essentially they're placing bets on things that may or may not work, right? And I find sometimes in government we can be so risk adverse. We kind of, we never want to be first. We don't even want to be second. We want to kind of wait until we're at the kind of the long tail of innovation. And I think the reality is things are moving so quickly now that I'm not sure governments can afford to wait to be at the very end of the innovation tail. And it doesn't mean we should chase the shiny object, because I think that's the flip side of it. We can very easily fall into shiny object syndrome where you're just investing in tech for the sake of it. But what I do really appreciate from what I've seen here and some of the discussions I've had is I think there's a real desire to say, let's be entrepreneurial inside a government. Let's invest in things that may or may not pay off, but we're going to learn from that and be able to advance.
Yeah, and what you just said just kind of reminds me of this thing that maybe governments need to change how they think about failure, because
Yep.
it's all about, we don't want to fail, we don't want to make that
Yep.
mistake. How about we change the process of succeeding by, maybe in a step-by-step gradual way, maybe
Hmm.
through public sector partnerships,
Yep.
or I don't know, there's 100 different ways of changing what you do.
Yeah, I mean,
What do you think?
well, I go back to my Pac-Man mental model around this, and that notion of kind of changing incentives, right? So I think right now, and certainly I see this in Canada, and I see this in some of the other governments that I've worked with, the incentives at an individual level for officials in government is not to take risks,
Mm,
right? You take a risk, you have a bad headline, it causes some challenges for you. But I think that's really where the magic is going to come from
yeah.
this is, until we kind of recognize that governments are made up of human beings and they all have those personal incentives. I think once we can start shifting the organizational incentives around being more risk taking and actually saying, if you're going to progress in your career, you should actually be able to show a track record of having tried things and actually having things that haven't
Yeah.
worked out, but that you've been able to learn from and be able to build from.
Yeah.
It's tricky in government because obviously your role is to safeguard the public interest
Yeah.
and you can't take irresponsible risks that
Yeah.
might put people at harm. But I think there are absolutely areas where you can experiment and we have to be able to find ways to foster that.
Yeah, and in the private sector, you see a lot of different movements take place, right? You look at, I don't know, some of the world's renowned companies, from
Mhm.
Siemens to GE to Microsoft and Google or Amazon. They all have created their processes. They all
Yep.
have specific ways of doing things,
Yep.
right? And I think that process-oriented approach, agile, nimble, all of those things, I think those need to be incorporated in government somewhere. And I see that happen here in
Hmm.
the UAE in particular. And henceforth, government can say, hey, we're going to do, these three things, and we don't know how we will succeed there,
Right.
but we have a process to get there, and hopefully that process will
Yep.
work, right? So it's a process. And that's my observation, is it's a process-oriented approach to succeeding and to learn through your failures.
Hmm.
Maybe we need a model on that. I actually think that GX, the Government Experience Forum that we're part of, does a lot of that with other governments. It has a template
Yep.
for excellence. And so I think there's definitely something
Hmm.
there. Um, what do you see happening worldwide? Do you see any trend emerging with respect to how governments see, uh, future readiness or succeeding, or one of those things?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think governments are almost having to work in two tracks simultaneously, in two speeds simultaneously. So on the one hand, I mean, I would argue in most governments around the world, they're still actually dealing with some of the very basic issues, right? Of how do we get the forms in a good in a good shape? How do we
Yeah.
get good data systems in place, right? And it's tough to actually have real innovation if you don't get some of the basics right. So I think governments are still working on that. We've heard this morning during some of the government service forum discussions around things like online payments and identity in a digital world, and those are kind of those foundational building blocks. On the flip side, we have these hugely disruptive technologies coming into society very quickly, things like artificial intelligence, things like the metaverse, that are quickly going from science fiction to being part of people's daily lives. And I think sometimes there can be this temptation in government to either go to one extreme, right? To either just look at the new tech that's coming down the pipe, or to only say we're just going to deal with the basics. And I think that's actually the real challenge governments are going to have to get into,
Mm,
is to be able to almost have that two-track ability to say we have to focus on the fundamentals, because if we don't get the fundamentals right, it's tough to take advantage of new technology.
yeah.
But we're going to have to also keep our eye on what's coming down, particularly given the increasing speed of those cycles and
Yeah.
that change.
Yeah.
And just to say, Ian, I think a big part of that, and this is what I'm really passionate about, is it requires training and capacity building and education for those in
Of
government.
course. Yeah.
I think we have to kind of recognize that we need public services around the world that are ready to tackle the challenges today. And a lot of traditional kind of hiring and the types of profiles of people we brought in 20, 30 years ago aren't the types of people perhaps we need to navigate public policy issues
Yeah.
in the digital world. And
Yeah.
that's I think one of the real challenges for governments is how do they kind of get access to the capacity they need
Yeah.
to be able to navigate these issues today.
Of course, I know that's very valid what you just said. Tell our viewers and listeners where they can find you and learn more about your work.
Absolutely. So my company is called Think Digital. Our website is thinkdigital.ca. They can find us on Twitter. They can find us on LinkedIn. And I have to mention, we're on a podcast here. We just launched a podcast called Let's Think Digital. So you
Right.
can go to letsthinkdigital.ca where we talk about a lot of these issues.
Incredible. Ryan, thank you so much for your time, my friend. It's been a pleasure meeting you, speaking with you again, and I hope we get to see each other
Thanks
soon.
so much, Ian.
Thanks
Pleasure.
so much. Thank you. And that's the end of this episode, friends. If you're listening, make sure you subscribe. If you're watching us, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much, and thank you for following GX.